And it's exciting that we have an industry that government can support, and especially with China's middle class bringing Australia and Tasmania. And the latest figures, I'm sure you've seen them, they were out a week ago. There was, in terms of the increase to Australia last year, there was a 5% increase when it's been flat overall with the high dollar, and 18%, the number one country where it was from China. And that's why it's so important, the speech from Kevin Rudd today, who without doubt would be regarded as the foremost authority in this country in terms of China, not only having lived there, speaking fluent Mandarin, but also his constant interaction. You probably wonder why somebody with a Victorian background, as we call derogatively, in Canberra, is introducing the Prime Minister, but he's a mate. He's a friend of mine, believe it or not, and I'm very happy here to support him and to invite him here to speak to us, because he is a great authority on China. China is a huge and important influence in terms of the future for us as a tourism industry. So you all know Kevin's background, so I'm not about to outline it in detail. A man who's highly regarded by the Australian public, a person who is fluent in Mandarin, a world expert in terms of China. We welcome him here today in terms of the implication for tourism, and particularly Tasmania for the Asian century. Thanks very much, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and to all of you who have taken some time out today to think about the state's future and the future of this great industry in Tasmania. Also Simon Current, the chairman of TICT, my good friend Lisa, who's a senator for the great state of Tasmania, Senator Lisa Singh. I don't know if our state parliamentarians have got here yet, have they? Wave their hands frantically if they have. G'day. Scott Bacon MP, Minister for Tourism, Will Hodgman MP, they're in the opposition. And also Master One, it's good to see you here, and friends from the Buddhist community. And to you all for taking some time to discuss this important subject for the future. Bruce was very kind in his remarks just now, but let me just say one thing about his own background, which wasn't mentioned in his own introduction. If you think about the global branding which occurred for Australia as a result of the Sydney Olympics only a decade or so ago, that didn't happen by magic. It actually happened through hard work. And it happened through the period of the then Liberal government of New South Wales under John Fay and earlier Nick Greiner. But Bruce, you're the bloke who actually did all the work. I actually know that. I was formerly a career Foreign Service officer. I was Director General of the Cabinet Office in Queensland, and I simply observed where the work was being done and the extraordinary lead up to the success of the Sydney Olympic bid. And so, Bruce, you're no slouch when it comes to getting things done. Well done. It's good to be back in Tasmania. I've spent a large part of the last 4 or 5 days up in the northwest. Last couple of days in Launceston. Drove down the Midland today, and am here with you at Hobart before returning to the People's Republic of Queensland this evening with my visa intact. My staff have worked out, because we were doing a trivia night up in Ulverston the other night, that this marks my 32nd visit to Tasmania over the years. And together with Therese and the kids, we keep coming back here in one capacity or another. A few Christmases ago, we spent, I was Prime Minister at the time, we spent several weeks here. We spent some time up at Cradle Mountain. I climbed Cradle Mountain with my kids and the Australian Federal Police security contingent. They had a defibrillator installed on top just for me. For the police, the ones who needed it at the end. We then spent the better part of a week or so over at Freycinet. Sapphire had not quite been finished, but I could see its shape clearly emerging above the trees before coming and spending some days here in Hobart as well, before fleeing north. And it's always good to come back to Tasmania to experience afresh what is truly an extraordinary natural environment, a remarkable architectural heritage, and to see and to experience a state carving out its own future in terms of Australia's Asian century. This is a state also, of course, which has known its own fair of tragedy over the years. And I think it's important that we reflect for a moment on the tragedy which has been experienced by our American brothers and sisters in the last 24 hours in Boston, where such enormous violence has been meted out on innocent people. It reminds us all of the fundamental importance of maintaining our vigilance on core questions of national security. So today I'd like to talk to you about Australia's future in the Asian century and Tasmania's great potential within that future. And I'm going to break it into about 3 bits. 5 core facts about where we stand in the global economy and the regional economy. 5 core facts in terms of where China is going for the period ahead. And 6 or 7 observations as an outsider, but someone who has a degree of attachment to this state personally, on how you could shape the future of the Tasmanian tourism industry, mindful of what China has to offer for us all in the future. But let's just go to some core facts on the economy to start with, because it's the foundation for all that we do. Fact number 1, never lose sight of the fact when you travel in the region of the world that this is a very strong national economy. It is a significant national economy. When you look at the data around the world, just recall these key elements, because they are the source of some wonderment around the world. This is the national economy which during the great global recession didn't go into recession. This is the global economy which over the last 5 years has grown by, this is the national economy which over the last 5 years has grown by 5%, whereas economies around the world by and large have contracted over that period of time. This is the economy which has an unemployment rate of 5.6%, half of that in Europe today, 2/3 of that in the United States. And frankly, on the employment front, one which has added nearly 1 million jobs over the last 5 years, when the rest of the world has been shedding jobs, most particularly in Europe and partly in the United States. And so when you put all that together, our growth, our employment, and the question which is often asked in the political debate, well, what about the underpinning public financial fundamentals? These are in strong working order as well. When you look at the data, and we're running a net debt to GDP ratio of 9.9%, against an average across the industrial economies, the major economies in the world, of some 80% plus. When you're looking at the same figure for Japan being 172%, when you're looking at the figure for the United States being 62% and rising, that for Germany 40 and 50% rising, that for the United Kingdom 60% plus and rising, and for a comparable economy like Canada, similar structure to our economy, 30 to 40% and rising. When the figure here peaks at 9.9 or 10%, everyone should take a deep breath before anyone seeks to exhale irrationally based pessimism about the fundamental strength of this national economy. And if you don't happen to believe any of the 4 or 5 stats I've just read, have a look at what the 3 global rating agencies say: Moody's, Standard & Poor's and Fitch. These are not sub-branches of the Australian Labor Party, last time I looked. These actually have a pretty clinical view of the world. Their mission in life is to make governments around the world anxious to the point of anxiety-led political depression. And these 3 rating agencies have given Australia's public finances AAA ratings, each one of them. That's the first time in Australia's history that's occurred. We're one of only 6 or 7 governments around the world which has a AAA credit rating on our public finances. So the reason I emphasise those points is that when we are marketing this country, this state to the world, be absolutely confident of the fundamental economic strengths of the Australian economy. They are right up there in the top of the pops as far as the global economic data today is concerned. Fact number 2, this ain't a small economy. It's actually a significant economy. You've got $1.3, $1.4 trillion worth of economic activity in this country. That makes it the 4th largest economy in Asia. China number 1, Japan number 2, India number 3, Australia number 4. We are the 12th largest economy in the world. 192 nation states in the world, this is number 12. That's why we're now members of the G20. So not only are the economic fundamentals strong, this is also a significant economy by any global economic measure. Fact number 3 is that Australia's economic future across the board is inextricably wound up with the economic future of Asia. This is an emerging reality, but has now become comprehensive. When you look at Australia's numbers, 8 of our 10 top trading partners are from Asia. And we also see that most of the world's growth in the global economy, both in the last 5 years and out for the next 15, will be generated out of Asia. This, therefore, has moved from the margins of global economic activity to the absolute epicentre of economic activity. Again, something which should give us collective confidence if we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. Fact number 4, the Chinese economy, within the explosion that we see across Asia, is the one which is driving the East Asian economic transformation the most. Most of the growth in Asia is coming out of China, but not exclusively. Indonesia is significant, Japan, possibly with the rejuvenation of its own economy through the recent actions under the government of Shinzo Abe, both on monetary policy and fiscal policy, and the reform of some of its own state-owned enterprises and the power sector, looks as though it could in turn finally emerge from a decade and a half of sustained deflation. And never lose sight of where Indonesia will go in the future as well. 250 million people next door to us, which by the time we get to the 2030s and 2040s will be among the top 7 economies in the world and larger than any of the individual economies of Europe, in all probability. So we happen to be located in the growth zone of the world, and China within that is generating most of the growth. And fact number 5 about China's economy itself is this. For China, we have seen an economic miracle over the last 30 years for an economy which has grown on average between 8 and 9% for 30 years successively. A few ups, a few downs on the way through, but averaging out at something in the vicinity of about 9%. So that China today stands as the world's 2nd largest economy. 30 years ago, it was the same size in GDP terms, market exchange rates, as the Australian economy. And by the time we reach another decade ahead, it will be the largest economy in the world, larger than that of the United States. And the Chinese now, 30 years after they began their most recent economic revolution, are engaged in something which is of fundamental relevance to everybody in this room. They are changing their growth model. The old growth model, which they have applied since Deng Xiaoping came back into power in the late 70s, is basically reaching its use-by date. What was the growth model? Number 1, based on labour-intensive, low-wage manufacturers for export concentrated in industrial cities along China's east coast, progressively moving inland as wage rates rose. Number 2, that fueled by high levels of state investment. And number 3, by low levels of domestic consumption. But not just with what has emerged with the global economic recession of the last 5 years, but for a range of other factors as well, the so-called middle income trap into which many developing economies fall, the Chinese, enormously sensible and far-sighted economic leaders, have decided they need to change the model. They've articulated this after about 10 years of research, as only the Chinese can do, put it into the current 5-year plan, which is there for all to see and read, published in 2010-2011. 2011. And the new government of Xi Jinping, led by Premier also Li Keqiang, now has this as its absolute central mission for the decade ahead. So what's the new growth model, and why is it relevant to us all in this room? The new growth model is along these lines. What it seeks to do is to transfer the traditional dependency on investment into a new dependency on consumption and domestic consumption as the primary drivers of the growth model of the future. Secondly, to do so also with a large concentration on the growth in the services sector, most particularly concentrated again within China's emerging second and third tier cities, of which there are literally hundreds with populations north of 1 million. And thirdly, on top of that again, to carve out a much greater space for the private sector in the future because they realise that such a monopolistic hold on growth in the Chinese economy during the first phase of China's economic transformation by state-owned enterprises is likely to strangle growth for the future. So therefore carving out more space for private firms than has been the case in the past. So why, again, is that relevant to all of us? Well, it's relevant in one sense because the Chinese are perfecting an economic transformation which doesn't cause them to sink into the middle income trap and remain frozen there into the future, as some other developing economies have done throughout economic history. Secondly, they still want to grow, which is good news for Australia and for the world. But thirdly, the growth being generated in particular through its services sector. And so the growth sectors for the future and subsectors are going to be in areas like education services, health services, financial services, construction, engineering, design and architectural services, environmental management services, and tourism services, domestically and internationally. That is where the growth, given the transformation of the growth model, is going to occur. And you can already begin to see it unfolding. So, 5 core facts about where we sit in the region and the world. Let me just now reflect for a moment on some of the emerging facts about China's own significance as a source of growth in the global tourism market and our own. Fact number 1, China in the year 2012 became, for the first time, the largest spender in the global tourism market of all countries. It passed in 2011 both the United States and Japan. So that as of 2012, China is now spending on international tourism some $102 billion. In the US and Germany, some $84 billion, thereabouts apiece. Number 2, this figure is projected to grow significantly out to the year 2020. And so that you're going to see continued significant, probably double-digit growth in this sector for the half-decade to decade ahead. Fact number 3, for Australia, we now have more than 500,000 Chinese tourists, 573,000 according to the 2012 data. This is now the second largest number of tourists coming to Australia from any country, and now replacing the United Kingdom as the second largest source of tourists to this country. Fact number 4, in 2012 we earned some $4.2 billion in inbound tourism from China as a national economy. It's projected that number will rise to $7.4 billion by the year 2020. And we are seeing faster international arrivals coming from China than from faster growth in international arrivals coming from China relative to any other country market. And fact number 5 goes to not just the quantity of visits, which is going like that, it's going to the quality of the tourism spend as well. On one calculation, which is total inbound economic value, the data as of 2012 is this. Chinese tourists spending per visit $6,422. Compared with the United Kingdom, $4,300. United States, $3,900. Germany, $4,850. India, again significant, but still slightly less than China, $6,247. And when Chinese travel, they tend to like to travel in groups. Not necessarily large groups, but they do like to travel in groups, family and extended friendship groups as well. This then is where the Chinese tourism industry is growing. These numbers are significant. They command our attention, assuming, of course, we know what to do about it. And And that brings me to my final set of remarks today. What should we do and what should we do differently? I say this advisedly because I have never worked in the tourism industry in my life. Although I come from Queensland, which is highly dependent on tourism, like the great state of Tasmania, I'm conscious also in this business of knowing that which I know and that which I do not know. So these are observations, friendly, from afar, about what I think this state, Tasmania, could do better for itself for the future. 7 points. Number 1, Tasmania, Australia is actually potentially a very good and great brand in China. In China, there are broadly 2 groups of tourists. There are the significantly, to the point of being super rich. There are more billionaires in China these days than there are in most other countries. Something people find remarkable when you're talking about a communist country, but that's a matter for theoreticians to resolve at some other point in history. But when you are looking at the Chinese tourism market, there is an elite market which is exceptionally wealthy, high levels of disposable income, and travelling in large numbers everywhere in the world. There's also a much broader market who are travelling for the very first time. And those of you who are grey enough in their hair colour and wrinkled enough to remember what it was like when the first Japanese arrived in this country in large numbers, frankly the phenomenon is not all that different. People who are expecting organised tours, 3-star and above accommodation, and to come in, again, groups, and then that to continue until that entire market has at least had some experience of Australia. But with both those markets, both the high personal disposable income market and the newly emergent lower middle class market, when they think of a place like this, what are its 3 essential assets? It's clean, it's green, and it's blue. That is, there's a blue ocean out there. The skies are also blue. If you live in downtown Beijing, you may have seen the news in the last 12 months. It hasn't been the cleanest of environmental experiences. In fact, the same can be said of most, but not all, of China's major cities. Therefore, the intrinsic appeal of being able to get out and to experience a clean environment with decent first-class accommodation and being able to experience something of the nature, the natural environment which we have to offer, is frankly up there at the top of the pops. So when I think, through my own experience of having travelled across Tasmania, I think of the southwest, wilderness areas, when I think most particularly of Freycinet and Sapphire, in terms of people who are at the top end of the market in China. When I think also of Cradle Mountain, walks, when I think of the wildlife, I think and I think more broadly across Tasmania as an island with an extraordinary coastline. And the ability to see some of these things from helicopter or from seaplanes. This represents a pretty attractive package for Chinese seeking to take a week out or 10 days out from an otherwise frenetic Confucian work schedule. Therefore, the natural environment is one to emphasise. I wouldn't seek to advertise Tasmania's colonial architectural heritage. People like us would enjoy that. I don't think the Chinese would give a bugger about it, to be quite honest. And I say that having been living in that country since 30 years ago. I enjoy it. It's part of a Western, shall I say, architectural heritage and a Western historical experience. But frankly, it doesn't actually register much on a Richter scale of Chinese interest. They want hotels to be clean, they want service standards to be good. They want also to be able to experience nature. Not extreme nature. Don't have them tumbling over cliffs with abseiling instructors, I don't think. Not just at first, anyway. But nature itself, clean, green and blue. Tasmania and Australia. The second thought I have is that Chinese, for centuries, have valued clean, appetizing seafood. But I love it. Last time I looked, you guys have got a lot of that to offer. It's absolutely essential to an effective Chinese tourism experience. What we've just eaten, in terms of a nice lump of steak from somewhere, which again, as an Anglo-Celtic myself, I thoroughly enjoyed, frankly, is not all that enjoyable for your average Chinese tourist. They will politely eat such dishes because they think that's what we kind of do, and they don't wish to offend anybody. Chinese like to eat Chinese food, interspersed with large slabs of fresh seafood. So if you're putting together how you would actually entertain groups from China, seafood, number 1, number 2, number 3, Chinese food the rest. And if you think mum's home-baked meat pie is the way through, think again. Does not translate, does not compute. Might make the cockles of our heart warm in a deep Tasmanian winter's evening as we reflect on other centuries and other bygone cultures from which we were once extracted. It doesn't mean a brass razoo as far as our Chinese friends are concerned. 3, the standard of accommodation, 4-star and above, if you are looking at where Chinese folks want to stay. They don't want to waste money in terms of this newly emerging middle class. Those at the top end of the spectrum won't care too much. But frankly, the idea that these folks are simply going to B&B their ways around Tasmania is not my experience of how Chinese prefer to travel. Point number 4, broadband, broadband, broadband. If you are a newly emerging Chinese middle class, and for the first time you're going to travel out of the country, you want to go somewhere safe like Australia. The great advantage of also being in the time zone of China, more or less. And you're going to entrust your assistant, Deputy Factory Manager Wang, to look after the business while you're away, and the 486 employers. What you want to know is that when the cat's away, the mice won't play. So you want to keep an absolutely close eye on what's going on with the business back home. So high-speed broadband is just an essential. If you speak to Chinese tourists of any level of disposable income as they travel around the world, they just assume that a place is going to be connected with 50, 100 megabits per second, depending on what part of the world that you're in. It's just, and if you go to the way in which the Chinese have laid out fibre optic cable across their country for the last 15 years, you get better broadband services in Ulamuchi out in Xinjiang province than you do in most regional cities in Australia. And so therefore the expectation of high-speed broadband being available for everything is absolutely fundamental. They won't feel comfortable being isolated from news back home, news concerning their business or the intrinsics of their business operation. So there's no ifs, no buts, no Malcolm Turnbulls about what sort of broadband you want. Our high-income tourists from China and elsewhere will simply have this as an elementary expectation. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why we do it, so that regional Australia doesn't get left behind. 5th point, Chinese-speaking staff. This is also essential. Think about it when you arrive at a hotel anywhere in the world, and the folk that you walk into don't speak a word of English. And you don't speak a word of Italian, French, Japanese, or whatever. It can be a pretty isolating experience. Put yourself in that position. And now you're a medium to high wealth Chinese international tourist. You're now the largest volume of international tourists in the world. Your spend per day is the highest in the world. And you're going to be greeted in the Queen's English only. Well, frankly, we need a bit more respect than that. One of the reasons I've been banging on about the teaching of Asian languages in Australian schools for the last 20 years is because our economic future lies in a region where English is not the first language, or the second, or necessarily the third. And if you hear people say, yeah, but folk who have made it in life in China and have got disposable income, they all speak English, well, partly so. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. Most of the Chinese who have made enough money to travel internationally are those who have actually done well in their domestic businesses where English is basically useless. And they've just not learned it. Maybe for the next generation, in 20 years' time, there'll be higher levels of English language proficiency, but not for this one. Most of my contemporaries in China and pals I've had up there for the last 20 years don't speak a word. Don't speak a word. And so you need to have somewhere on your staff someone who is perfectly able to converse in the basic things that they need. And this means an important investment in terms of your staff resources. Two final points. I was asked before, how best do you start getting a message out? Well, you've already got a whole bunch of messengers here in Australia. How many Chinese students are there studying in Australia right now? Anyone know? About 120,000. Australia is the second highest destination point for Chinese students in the world after the United States. And there's not a big gap between the US and here. This is a truckload of potential tourists. Not the students themselves, but their families. Out here at the University of Tasmania, my good friend from Qantas here was telling me before that at UTAS there are more than 1,000 Chinese students. And that's Stephen Farquhar is now the regional services manager of Tasmania. I was chatting to him about it before. It's not just 1,000 out here at UTAS, but the 120-odd thousand in the rest of the country who, in the period of their 3, 4 or 5 years studying in Australia, are going to want the family out here at some stage, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, and doing different things. This is an automatic platform for getting the message out by word of mouth. Which brings me to my last point about the way in which messages are communicated in China today. Mass advertising campaigns, I'm sure, have an aggregate branding value, and I don't dispute that. But in terms of advertising a specific product, the Chinese Twitterverse is alive and well. It's called Weibo, W-E-I-B-O. There are 350 million subscribers to Weibo. 350 million. And these are all kids and younger people involved in social media, all of whom have parents. And they're all looking for a deal in terms of, well, if I'm going to travel, where can I travel and what can I see? I've been on Weibo myself, and it's all in Chinese language, none of it's in English. I've been on Weibo myself for about the last 12 months. I have about 700,000 followers on Chinese Weibo, and I tap out messages about where I've been. And I'll be tapping out a message, in fact I did one last night about what it's like being in Tasmania. So, for the Tasmanian state government, I hope I've provided some benefit on the way through. But these mechanisms, without you engaging a mass campaign or a delegation of 1,000 people heading off to the backlots of China, these tools lie reasonably readily available to you, as long as you've got some Chinese language speaking staff. And then the very final point is this: people will often talk about the problems of air connections. I understand that. I think if you look at it from a national perspective, China is now more connected to Australia than it's ever been. The data that I picked up on the long drive south from Lonnie this morning says to me that we now have 300 flights from China to Australia every month across 5 different carriers, including Qantas, which means that you've got about 10 services arriving each day at one Australian port or another. Off the top of my head, it's Air China, or it's Hainan Airlines, it's China Southern, China Eastern, and Qantas, and I think Jetstar, maybe. At present, we have about 865,000 seats coming into the country. By 2020, we have capacity lined up, I'm told, with the various airlines' expansion plans for 2.4 million seats. Of course, the real art here lies in how do you get the arrivals into Sydney and to Melbourne to package it up so that once they looked at Sydney, looked at the Gold Coast or looked at Melbourne, that the other part of the package is going to come here. That's something which you in the industry, of course, are best able to attend to yourselves. But what I'm saying is the sheer capacity now coming out of China is quite large, and it's getting larger. So there are some observations. Number one, about the strength of our own economy and how therefore it's perceived in other parts of the region, other parts of Asia and around the world. Strong economy, and frankly a significant one as well. Number two, China now looms as the big growth driver in global tourism. and the big growth driver for Australian international tourism as well. Already number 2 in terms of a source country. And number 3, there's a whole bunch of practical things we can do about it. And a whole bunch of practical things that can be done here in Tasmania as well. I'm optimistic that we can do these things because the intrinsic nature of the product is good. People are friendly, the natural environment is great. You build on those things in the manners in which I've suggested, again, simply the observations of a friendly outsider who doesn't pretend to be an expert in your industry. And I think you can then start cooking with gas. Thanks very much.